Hello, welcome to Taking Liberties Radio. My name is Lee. We're having a special issue. We're a magazine now. Episode of our show. We're here, of course, with Vikas, and we're talking with David Allinson. We're going to talk about the sort of constitutional recognition of Aboriginals and sort of particularly a voice in Parliament. He's written in favour of it, and we're sceptical, so hopefully we're going to have an interesting discussion. So welcome, David. Please just sort of start off, or tell us a bit
Thank you
about
very
yourself.
much, guys.
And sort of how you got into this issue and kind of what the basic kind of argument for you in why you're in favour, particularly of the voice in Parliament, because I think that's a lot of people are like probably generally in favour of sort of recognition and preambles and whatnot, but a voice in Parliament, for particularly for Conservatives and a lot of other people, is going to be a little bit of like a step too far. So, yeah.
David?
Ooh, I think we're having issues with the lag. Can you hear us, David?
Yeah, sorry, it's lagged a little bit, but hi, I'm here. Yeah, so I'll explain a little bit about what I'm doing and how I got into it, and then I suppose we could unpack a little bit around the arguments for and against the voice to Parliament and some of the other alternatives you suggested. So I started getting involved in Indigenous affairs back in 2009 as policy officer for government. And one of the things that I found particularly frustrating, I suppose, about that job was just the sheer amount of money that gets spent on Indigenous affairs for diminishing returns. So I think it's something like $32 billion a year gets spent on Indigenous affairs in Australia. And for that massive investment, we've seen sequential closing the gap reports tell us that Indigenous Australians are behind all other groups of Australians by increasing margins in terms of their incarceration rates and in terms of their, well, everybody knows the statistics, right? So we were sitting around and we were thinking, a few years down the track, I've finished a law degree and I was wanting to do something, sort of get back into this space to try and improve outcomes for Indigenous Australians. And this idea of a voice to Parliament. And I think it's probably important to put very simply what the proposal is, because there's been lots of stuff going on in the media about how this is an Indigenous House of Lords or an extra. And all the idea of a voice to Parliament is an amendment to the parliamentary lawmaking process. So, for example, when Parliament's considering laws that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, there would be a group of people who would provide advice to Parliament on what those laws and how they might function more effectively. So it's not a veto power. It's not something that can hold up the legislature. It's really just advice being given directly to. The controversial aspect of it, I think, in terms of Australian history, is that it would require a referendum to have a constitutional mandate. But all that means is that future parliaments would be bound to listen to this voice, to listen to this body of people. So that's the proposal on the table. It doesn't actually affect who's in Parliament. It doesn't give Indigenous people a vote or anything like that. It's just an advisory body in Parliament. So that's the proposal as it stands. I think in terms of, there are some other alternatives. You mentioned the preamble, or there's a racial non-discrimination clause. But maybe we could thrash out the ideas around the voice a little bit before we look into the alternatives. What are some of the libertarian arguments against this voice to Parliament idea?
So I guess the question is the nature of the advisory body. Like you said that they discuss, what something means to the Aboriginal people, like the idea that a bill passes through Parliament as though it's going through normal royal assent, and then it goes into this advisory committee. Is that advisory committee able to veto or anything like that? No, that's not what you.
No.
No. So it's just like
yeah.
Yeah. So it's pretty much just the same as something like the Parliamentary Budget Office or whatever, which just gets routinely ignored. So I suppose it's not so much a libertarian counter argument. I'd say, what's the point of it then, other than, to take advice on board when there are actual already existing bureaucracies which advise, and there's ministry, obviously, that advises cabinet. particularly with relation to Aboriginal issues. So, like, I don't have an immediate objection to what you've suggested. I just think it seems to be ineffective and not ineffective. Sorry, that's the wrong word. It seems to be like an additional step to the bureaucracy that's expensive.
This is one of the main concerns that we were thinking about when we were trying to imagine how this might function effectively. So the idea would be is that there wouldn't be any part of the process where a bill is getting held up by this advisory body. It's not the case that there would be a bill considered by Parliament and then it would have to clear this advisory body. If the body, I think, if it couldn't provide its advice on time, then Parliament, then the bill would pass without having the advice being tabled. So there are lots of ways in which this body can be designed. And it's not for me to say ultimately how it will be designed, because we've deliberately left that drafting up to Parliament. It's actually Parliament itself that would provide the legislation that would enable the body. The only thing that we've suggested is that there's a constitutional hook, which would effectively give it a constitutional mandate. In terms of its effectiveness, I mean, who's to say how effective it will be? But the thing that we know is not effective is the way that Aboriginal affairs and Torres Strait Islander affairs are conducted in the country at the moment. We've got increasingly poor returns for our investment. And from my perspective, the one thing that really doesn't work when you're making laws for a group of people is not asking those people what those laws should look like. Because if you're trying to design an alcohol management program for Kununurra in Western Australia, the number one thing that doesn't work is, frankly, non-Indigenous bureaucrats sitting thousands of kilometres away deciding how to deal with alcohol problems that have really complicated and interesting cultural dimensions. And asking the people who the laws are affecting, I think, is the number one way to improve that lawmaking process. So effectiveness, it might not be effective. What's not effective is what we're doing right now, and I think that needs to change by empowering Indigenous people to take responsibility for their own affairs.
So I guess if maybe someone like Simon Brainey was here from the IPA, if he was here, he would say, well, there's already an advisory body. It's called Parliament. That's their job. I mean, why is that not... Why can't we just use the Parliament we have? I mean, they're there to represent their constituents. There are members of Parliament whose job is to advocate on behalf of their constituents in, northern Western Australia and the Northern Territory and Northern Queensland. So, what is it? Why are they doing? If they, I guess maybe the argument would be, well, if they're not doing their job, then how can we expect somebody else to do their job for them?
So you've taken one part of Brenny's argument. So the other part of Brenny's argument is actually along the lines of, so an MP is effectively that representative. It's that advisory, right? Why do you need a separate advisory, right, that represents them, that directly feeds into Parliament? Like, okay, so if I said, hey, we should have another advisory board that feeds into the parliamentary decision-making process, like one that represents all the Indian migrants, one that represents all the disabled people, all of that stuff. We just keep having more and more advisory boards based on, I guess you could say, communities that exist as a subset of Australia, as opposed to the representatives that people directly elect. What additional service does that provide, I guess, is the question.
I see these as two key issues. The first of which is, what's wrong with just having MPs? Yeah. And the second issue is, well, why are we treating Indigenous people as being special? But those seem to me to be the two criticisms in play here. As to the first, MPs represent a constituency. They don't represent a specific group of people who are having laws made specially about them. So, for example, Linda Burney might be Indigenous herself, but she represents her seat. She doesn't represent the Indigenous communities that are being affected by special laws that are being made in Parliament. And that really addresses the second question. I mean, this is really this is very, very much up for discussion. When I describe Indigenous people as being special, I'm not talking about them as being special snowflakes with, precious feelings just because they happen to be Indigenous. I mean, I do think that Indigenous culture is something that's important, and it's an important part of Australia's narrative. Indigenous people are special because they are treated as being special legally. No other groups of Australians, Indian Australians, English Australians, Dutch Australians, as Andrew Bolt has pointed out, don't have a special power that literally only there's an Indigenous people's power in the Constitution, Section 5126, and that allows Parliament to make laws just for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Simon Breeny I have a lot of respect for Simon Breeny's work. His recent paper suggested that we just get rid of this section in the Constitution. I mean, I think if I'm a libertarian and thinking about this, I imagine that I would want to just get rid of any racial discrimination in the Constitution at all, right? Why do we have a Constitution that identifies a special group of people? Unfortunately, the situation that we have in Australia at the moment is such that we have the Native Title Act and lots of other pieces of legislation that currently just through this power in the Constitution. So what has effectively the proposal on the table from the IPA's perspective is let's just get rid of this power. But at the moment, it's still very much a live question as to what would happen if you got rid of the racist power in the Constitution. If you got rid of it, at the moment, Parliament would have no power to repeal or amend any of the laws that they've made that affect Indigenous people. And that would create a tremendous amount of legal uncertainty. So I suppose this is actually really where me and my organisation, Uphold and Recognise, come in. Because we're constitutional conservatives. We don't like the idea of changing the Constitution at all. Which sounds strange for a group that's advocating for constitutional recognition. But what we really want to avoid is any legal... So the first thing that we would oppose is any sort of change that undermines the power of the sovereignty of Parliament. Anything that creates legal uncertainty in Australia, these are the things that we would absolutely assist with a no case against. And I'm talking a little bit, but I want to bring up at this point the question of a preamble or just symbolic recognition that you mentioned. In your guys' minds, what does that proposal stand for? Purely sort of symbolic or a preambular insertion? What have you guys heard as that being an argument for?
Oh, sure. So what I've heard about the preamble argument is basically just put into... so there is a fact... Sorry, it is a fact that the Aboriginal nations that originally inhabited in Australia were Australia's first people. That's not really in discussion. They want to put that... my understanding is you want to put that symbolically into the Constitution, like just as a matter of recognition.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. I think so. This idea was floated by John Howard in about 1999, and this idea is that you're effectively just saying they were here first. I think this is symbolic recognition, and there's two reasons why I would absolutely oppose any sort of purely aesthetic change to the Constitution. The first of which is, it's not something Indigenous people themselves want. Throughout the regional dialogues, the consultations that the Prime Minister and Cabinet facilitated over the last year, Indigenous people said, thanks very much. We've had enough symbolism. We really need some substance. And so, we can't keep going through these expensive processes without any real outcomes. So philosophically, Indigenous people don't want it. Why are you going to pursue an Indigenous advancement strategy that doesn't include Indigenous people's assent in it? But second of all, and this is from my perspective, probably the less important perspective in this, is that if you insert symbolic words into the Constitution, you create legal uncertainty. The Australian Constitution is not an American-style Bill of Rights Constitution. There's no we the people sort of statements. There's no poetry in it. And if you put symbolic language like Indigenous people have been here for 65,000 years, you include something that is potentially what's called justiciable, which means that the High Court might be able to look at that and consider it as being legally relevant. Now, as I said, I'm a constitutional conservative, and people like me, people like the Samuel Griffith Society, people like Julian Leeser, people like Damien Freeman and other eminent constitutional conservatives would absolutely oppose any purely symbolic change to the Constitution.
Yeah, and I was actually
because the High Court might be able to consider it as being legally relevant.
Yeah, so I was actually going to come to that. So Lee and I once had this argument about, what the symbolic insertion of that Aboriginals being here first would mean in the Constitution. And I pointed out that one of the key phrasings in the preamble is that the Federation is indissoluble, right? And that's been a massive question, and that's been a massive pain in the ass for everyone who's been arguing for West Australia's secession and all of that stuff, right? Is that they can't, technically the Constitution doesn't allow it. So so saying they were there first could have, and I think the IPS made the same argument, it could have far-reaching legal implications that nobody knows anything about, because it's entirely up to the High Court how they may interpret that, and you never know how they'll interpret it. So
well, actually, we kind of do. It's not for me to say what High Court judges think, but Stephen Gageler is now High Court Justice Stephen Gageler. And in 1999, when the idea of a preamble was floated, he responded in an article with Mark Leeming, which said, preambles in the Constitution are very likely to be justiciable. So we now have that man sitting on the High Court. So I think that gives you a pretty strong indication of where it might go. So on that subject, I'm in agreement with the IPA. I don't think symbolism without substance is just a waste of everybody's time and money.
Yeah.
Aside from the fact Indigenous people don't want it themselves.
Yeah. So, but coming back to your racial powers thing, I think so. Libertarians would actually argue that the native title. So we had this discussion, Lee and I, before, and I think we were in unison that native title doesn't actually go far enough. What needs to actually happen is increased level of sovereignty. They actually need to have their sovereign land back, as in they need to have proper property rights, because effectively for libertarians everything breaks down to property, right? So for us, so from our perspective, it's really simple. Allow them to have their sovereign land back, right? And we can basically arrange up a treaty as we would up with any other sovereign country.
Well, so I suppose what we're talking about here is what does sovereignty mean, and what's the relationship with treaty? Yeah. So my involvement in this process has really been about trying to find the best combination between Indigenous people's aspirations and what conservatives can live with effectively. That's where we are in terms of what Noel Pearson describes as the radical centre. What's the most ambitious proposal that you can follow given the political reality of the time? And at the moment, the idea of a national treaty is pretty far off. I think it's safe to say that the coalition, it would happen over there. And in terms of where we are with treaties at the moment, the funny thing is we already have a lot of treaties in Australia. We already have a lot of state level agreements and a lot of local agreements, the Noongar, those agreements being quite a famous one in Western. And so the question about what that means for Indigenous sovereignty, I think, is a really important one. The Uluru Statement from the Heart, which came out of, and there's this kind of really unprecedented consensus at a meeting at Uluru earlier this year, said sovereignty for Indigenous people is a spiritual notion, but of course it is very closely tied to land. I mean, personally, I agree with you. I think that maybe I can say this on record, I think it was a mistake. I think we're now seeing that there are serious problems with the native title system. I think to get rid of it would be an even bigger mistake, because at the moment we're set on this trajectory for property rights in this way. But I think we're now starting to solve native title. And I agree with you guys. I don't think it went far enough. I think, why are we treating Indigenous people as having special different kinds of property rights? The common law says it's because they've got traditional laws and customs. But the question for modern Australia is, how different do we really think those traditional laws and customs are from everybody else's? Yeah, I mean that's a question of the historical and cultural significance of Indigenous people, but we don't yet have a good way of solving this. But I suspect you guys are right. What's wrong with property rights for Indigenous people?
Yeah. So the other interesting thing, and I just realized because we were talking about Section 44 before this, right? We may actually one problem we might end up creating if we go with the sovereign part, and probably needs to. This is one exemption we might need in Section 44 is that if we create these treaties with these sovereign Aboriginal lands, we might inadvertently end up with basically locking Aboriginals out of our parliament, which would be unfortunate. So that is one area that I just thinking about it went like, okay, we probably do need to have a referendum on this one point, and we do need to look like I said to you in a prior conversation on Facebook. I'm not pro the idea of racial laws, but I am pro the idea of I'm happy to get rid of it and actually go in the other direction in terms of sovereignty. I want to go full sovereignty and just go, we're going to acknowledge the fact that this is your land, right? And you have sovereign control over it. Whatever that means customarily to you, that's up to you. But in terms of like your dealings with Australia, I would open the door and say, look, we're here now as a country, and you've got your own little country within, and I'm absolutely fine for there to be, just open door policy between the two.
Wow, that's a radical idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess also tied to how the property would, and I'm an anarchist, so I'm pretty comfortable with notions of sort of sovereignty for small groups. I mean, that's. Well,
it's
firstly, I mean, the property thing is separate. Like, you can still give people back their property. So you could scrap natal title and just turn it into real title and not have the sovereignty. So that's kind of a separate thing. That's an additional thing, which would be great. But it's obviously politically very difficult. But then also what would happen is, I mean, I presume a lot of people who don't live in the areas of country where they're handing back land would live there. So, there'd be a lot of people who'd be descendants of this group who now, instead of living in northern Western Australia, they live in Perth. And they're not necessarily going to want to move back because they're not, tied to the land. I mean, ancestors were tied to the land, but they're not. But they still, because property gets passed down through the descendants, we would presumably allow all the descendants to have a slice. They would then forego. And so what you'd end up with is sort of a geographical sorting. People who, wouldn't want to return will get a payout or would, get a financial share or whatever. And then those who want to live there, they could do their thing. And if we had sovereignty on the table, they would have their own sovereign tribes, which is great. And those who don't necessarily want to be there, they just go on with their life. So, I think the thing about, say, property as opposed to native title is that, it doesn't necessarily prohibit people from sort of making choices. They can still, if they're not necessarily have to be sort of financially tied into these things. They can do what anybody else does, which is if you find out you have a share of a German castle in Bavaria, you'd be like, well, I don't want to live in Bavaria. I'm going to sell my share and somebody else can have it instead. So I guess that's the argument for one of the, in my view, for property.
Property, for sovereignty,
separate from sovereignty. I'll ask a question. If that's right, because so we've already had advisory boards in the past. Like ATSIC, that was, I guess, the one that I remember, which, if I recall correctly, didn't end so well. There was a lot of corruption allegations when it all collapsed. Why wouldn't a non-constitutional advisory committee be worth pursuing? Why does it need to be in the Constitution?
Well, this is really a question, and you're right to point out. You mentioned ATSIC. And one of the principal problems with Indigenous organisations is that as soon as they start looking like they're not functioning perfectly well, they just get wrapped up. I mean, this is a. I'm not going to pull any punches. This doesn't happen with non-Indigenous organisations. When the ATO has senior members horrifically, coming out with really serious and well-founded allegations against them, they don't pack up the ATO and go home.
Although
with Indigenous organisations, as soon as
we kind of wish they did.
Yeah. On this podcast, yes, absolutely. ATO, see you later.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, you look at and this is really, this comes back to the MP question as well. MPs typically are bound by party policies, by party lines and party policies. They can't pursue what's best for Indigenous people because they're just simply not mandated to do it. And when it comes to the Indigenous Advisory Committee, we see consistently Indigenous leaders have come out supporting the government line, or they get the axe. You know, Warren Mundine came out, called the Prime Minister a dickhead in public, like that. You know, within a couple of months, his job. What the constitutional mandate does, it allows these people to speak freely and frankly about what's going to improve laws and policies that affect Indigenous peoples. That's effectively why the constitutional mandate is so important. Because if it doesn't have a constitutional mandate, I guarantee that as soon as it starts saying things that are even remotely critical of government policies, irrespective of how dysfunctional they might be, you're going to see it get wrapped up pretty quickly. So the idea, the constitutional mandate is to ensure its longevity, so subsequent parliaments would be bound to just listen. I mean, we're not talking about a veto, you know, it's really just about listening to these people and allowing them to speak freely and frankly about how they think laws and policies will look. Yeah, so I suppose that's why I think the constitutional mandate's important.
Why wouldn't you end up having the same sort of dysfunction in that voice, though? I mean, this, like, in the end, I mean, I presume it'd be some sort of system of voting for the people who would sit on that representative body. I mean, people like Aboriginal people are not singular. There's lots of them, and there's lots of variety in thought. And how do you, I mean, surely you just end up with the same level of dysfunction where the voice to Parliament doesn't listen to what people say, because you're going to end up having parties, you're going to end up having alliances. It's not necessarily going to be sort of a singular voice. It'll end up being like our real Parliament, which is muddled and dysfunctional. And I mean, like presumably people who sit on this advisory committee the advisory board would be body would be paid, and so you know you're gonna end up with a lot of people who are just going to do it because, well, a nice cushy government job is preferable to a lot of the alternatives. Certainly in remote Australia, you know, if you can go from there to live, like go to Canberra regularly, fly to Canberra and get paid and all the rest of it. I mean, it's how does the voice to Parliament end up not just being like Parliament, which is dysfunctional and stupid?
Well, that was actually one of the points that I was going to make. You've got a lot of governmental processes that seem to function effectively, despite the fact that you've got some disagreement between the people in it. And I think that's the hallmark of an effective democracy. As Noel Pearson said, that this actually will be quite a political body. It's going to be dealing with really difficult issues. You know, you can't start dealing with Indigenous affairs without pretending that it's all going to be, it's not an easy policy area, and it will require a lot of disagreement, and it's going to be difficult to find a way of putting people on it in a way that's representative of those communities, that also balances that with maybe having some government-appointed representatives on it as well. It's going to be very difficult to find the right balance there. So I absolutely take your point about the fact that it will be difficult to find the right policy balance there in terms of its representative structure. But when it comes to how effective it is, I'll just point to every other democratic institution that we have in the country that has as its core, I think, reasonable disagreement. And I just have to say, I don't shy away from the idea of the advisory body initially in its first few months of operation, maybe in its first few years, being a force for some significant radical advice, because some significant radical advice is going to be necessary to turn around the horrifying statistical gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. There is literally nothing that is going well in this area except for year 12 leaving scores. That $32 billion a year is going down the toilet. We need some radical change, I think, to shuffle things up. And I hear what you guys are saying about sovereignty and property rights, but we've just seen the Prime Minister reject this proposal, and I think this is a modest proposal. This is like, hey guys, we just want to give you advice. The gulf between that and treaty and between that and sovereignty is just tremendous. Yeah. And the fact that the Prime Minister so rashly rejected this proposal, it's going to be something that I think might have to happen under a future government, under a different government, if it's going to happen at all. But that's really where we are at the moment in Indigenous affairs in this country. It's a modest proposal, worked on, Indigenous people led these proposals, but Conservatives sat down and we listened to what they were saying. And and said, yeah, this sounds reasonable. This addresses our concerns for constitutional minimalism. But the Prime Minister still said no. So,
But,
I mean,
the $32
how it would
billion
function is not the biggest problem for me at the moment. It's getting the idea up off the table.
I mean, the $32
See,
billion
here's
is the reason that's a failure is not necessarily because of the representative lack of representation for Aboriginal people. I mean, in the end, it's that
It's a government
department
program,
It's a
Taylor.
government program. I mean, and so if you just lump that in with all other government programs and say, do we get our $400 billion worth of value out of the taxes that we pay to the government? I mean, certainly on this podcast, being libertarian, we're going to say, well, hell no. And a lot of the things that, I mean, like the race power essentially allows a lot of paternalism that you wouldn't otherwise get away with. So, I mean, leaving aside whether the race power stays or goes, if we just say, well, what is the problem with the money that is spent in this area? Well, it's that government thinks it can run the lives of Aboriginal people and it treats them differently, and it tries to do certain things, and it's allowed to get away with more than it could, but it's still doing what it tries to do everywhere, which is micromanage people's lives, try to deliver outcomes when, well, as libertarians we would say, well, the real issue is that, well, they don't have the right knowledge. They can never have the right knowledge, and so people far away shouldn't be making decisions about the lives of those people. So I mean, surely like this voice wouldn't fix that problem though. So like, yes, they have more input, but like in the end, you've still got the same problem of governments trying to create outcomes that it just can't create because that's not how the world works.
Yeah, so I actually question how radical the notion of sovereign land for Indigenous peoples actually is. Because if you look at, so in the United States alone, there are 326 sovereign native countries contained within the United States, right? And and we all know about how slow the United States can be about, recognition of minority issues. But one of the areas they've done really well is returning sovereign land back to the Native American people. And I question how they did it so easily. Like it was resolved in a court as a property issue. And because they have such a strong emphasis on property rights there, it just then exploded to everyone going, well, this is, our property, and this is our sovereign property that you stole from us. And the state was kind of forced to give it back through effectively the US judicial process. And Canada has a very similar experience. So I guess the question is, why do we need to sit around dealing with race power and native title when clearly what we need to do is take a look at America, take a look at what precedents were set with respect to sovereign land there, and take a look at Canada, because Canada is a British, I guess you could say, still within the common law, Commonwealth structure.
Exactly. What you're describing is exactly the problem that Australia is in, because unlike US, Canada, and New Zealand, Australia's Indigenous peoples never have. That's the principal reason that we're in the situation that we're in now, with native title having to put Indigenous rights in for normal instead of dealing with it at a national level. I should say, in terms of sovereignty, we should be clear about what we mean by sovereignty, because I did my PhD research on sovereignty. So I think there's a lot of different ways in which we can use it, and it can mean something like old classical sovereignty, so the idea of a nation state, and then it can also mean something like self-determined people. So in the US and Canada, you have something a lot closer to traditional conception of nation, but within a broader nation, obviously. You've got a lot of different, as you pointed out, you have a tremendous amount of traditional owners there who have much healthier, I think, property rights and property interests than Australian Indigenous people, Australian Aboriginal people. And in Canada, a similar situation. In New Zealand, you've got the Treaty of Waitangi, which guarantees Māori's specific rights. So in Australia, we've had to deal with it in a really roundabout way. Of course, we get to the point where we have a constitutional recognition of the fact that these people even exist as Australian entities in 1967. And then with the Native Title Act, it's kind of, in my view, this band-aid approach to a system that was fundamentally, and I think there's no going back now the idea of getting rid of the Native Title Act and stuff, it legally, just given the environment that we exist in at the moment, the best we can do is try and make the Australian system, because there's no just getting rid of the racist power now. There's no legal expert in the country that's suggesting that it could just be done without creating a tremendous amount of instability. So in terms of questions, yeah, I mean, I think we're in agreement that sovereignty is something that is important for Indigenous people, and it's something that's important to support them. Because frankly, I think they know best in terms of the laws and policies that they should be living on, and they should be self-determining in that way, and we should stop telling them how they should be living their lives. But yeah, in terms of the differences between other common law jurisdictions and other Commonwealth jurisdictions and how they've dealt with Indigenous affairs, we're in a unique situation, so we need a unique solution to our problem.
So
yeah.
just to my question, so like with the effectiveness generally of spending, to get this return on the $32 billion, you've got the Hayekian problem of knowledge and of so how does this, I mean, I guess from a libertarian perspective, we would just say the government shouldn't be doing any of that. Like state governments, sure, local governments, absolutely. If governments to be doing something, it shouldn't be federal governments. They should just give the $32 billion to the states, or give it to, I mean, they can't give it to local governments because, that's how it works. But, like they can give it to the states to give to the government. But like it's, how would this, does this voice deal with that problem of the hierarchy knowledge problem of addressing issues from far away?
Look, I think that's precisely the problem that the voice is designed to address. So it's been in different ways in which people have thought about this, and I think the most effective one of the really great ways it's been thought of was by Tim Wilson, who's of course one of the ex-human rights commissioners and ex-director of the IPA. And his idea was that on the ground, it would empower local communities and to feed their advice up into regional representative bodies, which would ultimately reach the advisory body at a national level. And the reason why you need that structure is because the local issues really are questions of federal policies that determine ultimately what happens on the ground. So the question, you raised the question before about, ideally, I think you can actually already use existing mechanisms to do that work. We already have a tremendous amount of Indigenous organisations, prescribed bodies, corporates, native title representative bodies. There's even already some broad representative systems in place that could actually do quite a lot of this work. Whatever it costs, it's got to be better than what we're doing at the moment, which is frankly just flushing money down the toilet.
It's pretty low bar to do better than what we're currently doing.
Things like the wealth, it's a low bar. Well, like the healthy, but just to kind of give you a practical example, something like the healthy benefits cards in Ceduna and Kununurra, which were designed to stop, to prevent alcohol abuse. Now, probably the first thing that they should have done was go into a community and ask people, hey, what would happen if you had a card that you could only spend on food or groceries? And I think any sensible person in that community would say, well, to be honest, I think I would probably just exchange it with somebody else for cash. And that's the first thing that happened in those communities. And it cost $200 million to find that out the hard way. It's just through a basic lack of consultation that these things happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess also, from a libertarian economist.
So in terms of
oh, you keep going. We got a bit issued lag, so sometimes you'll be talking and we won't hear you. So you keep going.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of lag, so I can't actually. I'm sorry, guys. I found it very difficult to hear. I didn't hear any of what you just said. I'm afraid.
That's fine. Well, maybe, Vikas, do you have any further questions?
No, no, no. I think we covered all of the main issues around the voice. Look, yeah, I'm pretty much on the. I think that this is. Look, I think it's just going to be another expensive edition, and I think it'll be mostly ignored. The proposed voice, and I think the Prime Minister basically just avoided the potential of angering Conservatives while creating an ineffective and expensive, I guess you could say, pseudo parliament.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I respectfully disagree because you've got people across the political spectrum, especially Conservatives, people like, Chris Kenny's not exactly I'd say he's on the Conservative end of the spectrum. People like Alan Joyce, people like General Michael Jeffrey, these are people who are Conservatives and eminent Australians. General Jeffrey isn't exactly a Conservative, but he's an ex-Governor General of the country. And he certainly wouldn't put his name to something that he didn't think was something that's in the national interest. What I'm worried about, because I think we've had a really productive and engaging conversation today, but what I'm worried about is that the Prime Minister's sort of rejecting this proposal without really looking at the potential benefits and without looking at the potential, when it comes down to it, the potential improvement that it could make to lawmaking. And I'm worried that conversation isn't really being had at the moment.
Yeah. So, sorry, when I said Conservative, I realize this is probably a definitional situation here. So, when I say Conservative, I don't mean people adhering to, the philosophies and ideas of Edmund Burke, the father of conservatism. That sort of strain of intellectual thought based in, the idea of preserving traditions and institutions. I'm talking about conservative like, Erica Betts and, Cory Bernardi, which is considerably more reactionary and based in identity politics. And they unfortunately have taken over what is the voice of what you would call conservatism in Australia.
Well, I'll tell you about what Cory Bernardi said about this proposal is that he saw it as simply codifying the existing practice of the race power. He saw that this was actually just a way of effectively formalizing the way that things currently exist.
Yep.
While also just acknowledging the fact that, this idea of having a voice was relatively uncontroversial. I can't speak for his mind because that conversation was a year or two ago. But he sees, people on the right side of politics see the benefits to this.
Yeah.
I mean, there's all this stuff now about Turnbull, in 2015 saying that this was a good idea. And I'm not saying the Prime Minister of Australia isn't entitled to change his mind, but historically, people on the right side of politics have seen that this is an effective way of dealing with the problem.
Oh, you don't have to tell me.
It's a good idea. The question now is, I think they've just made an assessment about what they think Australians will wear. And I just don't think they want to go to the expense of educating Australians about the proposal. I think that's what it comes down to, because it's a complicated idea. They just don't want to go to the expense of educating people about it, which is, I think, a wasted opportunity.
So, I was going to say, just especially when you've got a PM who is on a razor thin, he's on thin ice as it is. I'm guessing he doesn't want to go sort of for long Hail Mary type policy proposals. I'd say my mind is not really changed from this discussion. I mean, I don't think it's a terrible idea. Like, I've heard worse ideas. Like, out of the many things that you hear in the political process as a libertarian, you're like, there's stuff that's way dumber. Like, anytime Jackie Lambie opens her mouth to say we should, force all the young people into the military, I'm like, no, definitely never. Where this is like, it's got some pros, got some cons. I mean, I think I'm a bit like Vikas. I think it's probably going to be ignored. And while, yes, there are people now who think it's a good idea. The question is, will there be people in 50 years' time, 100 years' time? Because that's the issue with, like, the upside of the constitutional thing is, they can't get rid of it because it's inconvenient. The downside is, it's bloody hard to change the constitution. And once you put it in there, it's never going to go away. And if the thing evolves, like if the status quo evolves or if something arises, you just think about the nature of federal-state relationships. When they set out the constitution, it was supposed to be very, states do state things, federal do federal things. And what have we seen? We've seen the High Court essentially, cut the balls off the states. And now we have a situation where the federal government is the only game in town, effectively. So I guess my skepticism remains that it's, like I'm not sure how it will. And of course, it's never to say that you should just ignore any proposal because you don't know how it's going to pan out. But I think particularly when it comes to putting things in the Constitution and its effectiveness and the potential side effects, we're talking about large scale implications of where that could go and what that could do. And I guess if it's not going to be effective, which I don't think it will be because of the same problems that make Parliament ineffective and MPs ineffective, I don't think I would want to see much change. So, and Vikas, maybe you want to give your final thoughts and then we'll wrap it up. We've been going for 45 minutes. So, and then David, you have the final word and you can lay the smack down and tell us how we're wrong and we'll leave it there. It's the best way to finish the podcast.
Yeah. So I've got a more nuanced opinion. I think in the short term it's good. So in the short term, I think it'll achieve most of what you want, which is more Aboriginal voices being heard in Parliament. More issues about Aboriginal people being heard by Parliament. Maybe a little bit of consideration on policy here and there. But Lee kind of touched on what I would call my main objection to this is in the long term. The way it's codified race power, I want to move in the long term to getting rid of the race power, right? That should not be a thing. It's only there because of a hangover from our pre-Federation days. And it's an indictment on our society, I guess you could say, that we haven't sort of progressed our laws and progressed, I guess you could say, Parliament to an area where our lawmaking doesn't require something like the race powers to effectively grant a notion of political equality. And that's my main objection to this in the long term, is that I want to move towards political equality without the need for something like race power. But yeah, in the short term, I think it'll achieve most of what you say it will, and it's a good idea in the short term.
Well, yeah, look, thank you very much, guys, for having me on the show. I certainly don't think it's my place to lay the smack down, but all I'll say is that when we're trying to improve outcomes for Indigenous people, that's really great. And the Uluru Statement from the Heart and this proposal, including a voice, is what they've asked for. And so from my perspective, it's less that this is some white guy nerdy hobby horse that I want to really just see happen because I think it's a great legal solution. It's actually just mostly because this is what the people who are making laws for have asked for. And from my perspective, it's sometimes just polite to, instead of telling people how you think you can fix their problems, to listen. So that's kind of, I suppose, where I'm at. And I very much enjoyed having this conversation with you guys. Thank you very much for inviting me on the show.
Oh, no, thanks for joining us. And it's been really interesting. And certainly, if there's any developments, we'd love to have you on again because, this is an area, for me, I actually really care about this issue because I think, I think it's just horrendous what's happening in these communities. And it's really just such a colossal failure of government policy that we've got these, hundreds of thousands of people who are living in dire poverty in a first world nation where that really shouldn't be the case. So yeah, I think Aboriginal, for libertarians in particular, I think we need to really be concerned about government policy in this area because it's effectively screwing the most disadvantaged people that we have in the most just terrible of ways. So yeah, if there's any further, we'll definitely have you on the show. Brilliant. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Right. And for everybody who's listening or watching at home, we'll put links to Uphold and Recognise, which is David's organisation, and his response to Simon Brainey, who wrote about this at the IPA. So there'll be a bit of reading if you want, further reading if you want. And yeah, we'll be back again on Monday or next week with another episode.